Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. Now, in Malaysian politics, we often focus on the number of women elected as members of parliament. However, being appointed to cabinet is just as crucial, if not more important. And having more women in cabinet doesn't automatically mean fair share of power. So Maha Balakrishnan is a parliamentary and institutional development specialist. Her latest research delves into women in cabinet in Malaysia for the past 15 years. It goes beyond the numbers in understanding women's roles in political decision-making positions. Maha, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm hoping that we could kind of jump right into the thick of things. Before we get into the research, maybe you can share a little bit about yourself with our audience, about yourself and the work that you do, and why you're so passionate about it.
Well, I'm a researcher and consultant for democratic institutional design and policy making. Basically, what that means is that I look into how institutions and policies can be improved in order to enhance democracy and to protect human rights. And one of the areas that I'm currently focusing on now is female political participation.
Right. So tell us about this study on women in the Malaysian cabinet. What trends did you observe over the 15-year period that you researched?
So just a little bit of background to why I wanted to focus on women in cabinet in particular. The low number of women in politics has been a perennial issue in Malaysia, not just Malaysia, but across the world. And while it remains a global issue, it is a specific problem for Malaysia. And we can track this, or rather we know this, simply by tracking indices such as the Gender Gap Index, for example, right, which is released on a yearly basis by the World Economic Forum. Now, there are 4 indices in that index. It looks at 4 indicators, rather. It looks at political participation, it looks at educational empowerment and participation, it looks at health access, and finally economic access, right? So these 4 indicators. And over time, Malaysia has improved on all the indicators, not enough, but almost achieving parity for education and health. And for the economy, I think we're at about 0.6 at a ratio. But for political participation, we still are at 0.1. So if I were to break this down, what that actually means is that for every 10 positions of political power accorded to a man, 1 is accorded to a woman. Yeah, so you can see the disparity there, and it's across time. Yeah, there's just been no change over a significant number of years. Now, to address this issue, most people concentrate on trying to improve the number of women that run for elections, that get into parliament. But this is where I thought we're actually perhaps missing the bigger picture here, because where is the real seat of power when it comes to political decision making? And no matter how we may want it to change in a parliamentary democracy, the seat of power is still Putrajaya. Yeah. So we really need to focus, in addition to making sure that there are enough women in parliament, we really need to focus on how many women are sitting in cabinet, holding key portfolios and making key decisions. But of course, sorry, Melisa, go ahead.
Yeah, so if I just may jump in very quickly, when we think about that, women who have a seat at that table of power in Putrajaya, what did your research show about the specific portfolios that women held over the 15-year period?
So I decided to look at the portfolios given to women over 15 years. So that runs from 2008 to 2023. And I was looking not simply at full numbers, right? Not just the proportions of, how many cabinet ministers are there, what is their proportion in relation to male cabinet members, but I was also looking at the portfolios that they held. So to come to your question, what I found is that the types of portfolios and the nature of portfolios are as important as the numbers. So if I could just give some background on this, if we could start first at looking at the proportions, yeah? So we can see that across the 15-year period, there has been some increase in the number of proportion of seats in cabinet allocated to women over time. A small change, but a discernible change. So between 2008 and 2018, for example, we had approximately only 3 to 10% of seats allocated to female cabinet members. From 2018, after the 2018 election, this jumped. This jumped quite significantly and up to about 16 to 18%. And what's interesting about the post-2018 period is that, for me as a researcher, is that we had multiple government turnovers, right, between 2018 and 2022. And the multiple government turnovers also meant that all the different parties within our political system had a chance to take control of Putrajaya, had a chance to name their cabinets. And all of them across the board, we see, decided to put in at least 5 female ministers within the cabinets. So this meant that we saw this huge leap from about 3 to 10% to 16 to 18% post 2018. Now that was maintained post GE15 as well. Yeah, so all looks good, right? We've seen some progress, but how does it measure compared to international standards? So we still fall far short, because the average cabinet internationally, globally, it has approximately 22.8% of female members. And only, I think, in about 13 countries do women actually hold 50% of cabinet positions. Yeah, so these are 2023 figures. So we still fall far short of global averages. That's one aspect, right? But it's not enough to have X number of women in cabinet. Are they actually being given the portfolios that matter? Are they actually being given decision-making power over the issues that matter to the people? And also, are they being given portfolios that could actually increase their own prestige, their own profile, that will make sure that they can advance in politics and perhaps climb the ranks even within cabinet? So in order to decide that, in order to analyze that, I looked at 2 different aspects. One is the budget allocation accorded to the various portfolios that were given to men and to women, and did a comparison. And secondly, I looked at the type of portfolios, something called portfolio saliency. And this is a little complicated, but what portfolio saliency really is based on an international study, right, that looks at the types of portfolios across the world, and we then assess based on past practice and history, the political history and the country's history, what are the key portfolios in each country that can ensure high profile for the person holding the portfolio, and that can also ensure good political returns for the MP holding the portfolio.
Right. So it also has to be some kind of payoff for the person who holds the portfolio in terms of the political mileage, the political capital that they get being in that ministerial position. Let's talk a little bit about the budget allocations first. When you look at the portfolios that matter in Malaysia, in terms of budget size, what did you find, and how many of them were being helmed by women?
Well, initially, none at all, I would say, with the exception, I think, of when Rafida was holding the MITI role. Apart from that, almost all the portfolios allocated to women before 2018 were low budget portfolios. In other words, portfolios that received actually very little funding, even if the policy areas covered by a particular ministry was quite large. For example, the Women's Ministry, Women and Children's Ministry, usually has a huge portfolio, but actually their budget size, they have one of the lowest budgets across time. Yeah. The other high value portfolios in terms of budget would normally be rural and regional development, finance, for example, health and education would also fall within that grouping. Now, after 2018, things change. Right? After 2018, we see firstly a jump in the number of female MPs in cabinets, but we also then see the types of portfolios that are being allocated has also changed. For example, we see that a portfolio, the rural and regional development portfolio was actually allocated to a woman. We see now, especially after GE15, the health and education portfolios being handed in originally to female ministers as well. Now, these portfolios are budget-heavy portfolios. And what does this actually do, right? So if a minister has a high budget portfolio, it means then that the development projects, the activities, the operating budget, which includes the hiring and firing and the selection of people to different posts, all of this is increased. And the capacity of the minister, therefore, to make a difference politically, to make a difference economically, and also within specific constituencies or groups of voters increases. Yeah. So this is why budget matters.
When we think about portfolios that are considered high in prestige or high in terms of political impact, what did you find? What was it that you found in your research that showed maybe the career prospects of the women ministers had changed over the course of time, holding specific portfolios, whether some portfolios have higher visibility, higher recognition? Did that shift in the political landscape when it comes to women in ministerial positions?
Yes. So what we see after 2018 especially is that the number of portfolios which fall into medium prestige, which are not considered feminine or soft, right? Which are considered not necessarily masculine and hard, but somewhere in between. We see that these portfolios are also now starting to be allocated to women. For example, the housing and local development portfolio in 2020. I referred earlier to the rural and regional development portfolio. Then you have innovation and tech. Sorry, you have the environmental portfolio that was originally hemmed by YB Yo after 2018. Now, all these portfolios are considered medium prestige portfolios, and it is, of course, becomes very attractive. Simply because of the range of policy areas and the policy impact that these portfolios can hold. So we see that improvement post-2018. Post-2022, with the allocation of the portfolios of health and education to female ministers, this increases. These are actually high-level portfolios, right? So we see a huge improvement post-2022. Of course, unfortunately, the recent cabinet reshuffle has meant that we've backtracked a little when we see a female MP lose such a key portfolio. I do want to say, though, I think this might be the right point to just a note of caution, really, that while ensuring gender parity is important, the primary objective of cabinet selection must always be merit. It must always be based on merit. But the simple argument where gender equality is concerned or gender political participation is concerned is this, that if you have a male candidate and a female candidate of equal merit, then you should select the female candidate for the position in order to achieve a certain minimum threshold of representation in cabinet.
Can I ask you, Maha, whether your research revealed anything interesting about the way, at parity, so equal merit, equal skill, if women in the Malaysian cabinet face, what the challenges are that women face in terms of getting that position, getting the prestige portfolio, as opposed to getting a lower or a medium prestige portfolio?
Well, I think the challenge really comes down to a couple of factors. Number one is the political culture in Malaysia, the political party culture in particular in Malaysia, is, I think, the greatest impediment. We have a political party structure that's based on patriarchy. The leadership positions of almost all political parties, although some are changing, but generally still being held mainly by men, still being held mainly by men. But it's the external structures as well, the players that support political parties whether within at constituency level, district level, and so on, within the business community even perhaps, all also still male dominated. So breaking that barrier, breaking those, multi-layered glass ceilings still, I think, remains our greatest challenge. Now, the other factor that could potentially stand in the way, one that's often cited, especially when it comes to trying to increase the number of women running for electoral office, is societal and cultural norms. Yeah. Now, I'm not actually sure whether that holds as strongly today as it did before. And the reason I say this, and this is just based on anecdotal evidence, based on my study and what I was looking at. Now, one thing that struck me after 2018 is that we had a whole new set of parties come into power. We had a minimum of 5 women in cabinet at any one time. They were holding portfolios that no woman minister ever had before. And yet there was very little public pushback on that aspect. Right? Now, there were a myriad of other issues that were raised about cabinet selection, whether it was party balance, ethnic balance, all these other issues. And of course, women were still facing, women ministers, women politicians, they were still facing gender-based harassment, That's true, but there wasn't an overt pushback from the public about women holding these different ministries, right? So that tells me that if there is still a barrier, then the primary challenge here is one of party politics and party culture.
That is fascinating to me, because it challenges the notion that it's always been, the public won't accept, or it's a perception that women are less capable in high profile portfolios. I want to ask you about one thing your research pointed out, which was you cited a tipping point, a threshold of 17% of cabinet membership for impacting the allocation of portfolios to women. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, based on my research and my analysis, I realized that there is actually a threshold of portfolios after which there is no alternative but to appoint a woman to a medium prestige or high prestige portfolio, simply because the number of portfolios that can be classified as low prestige or soft are limited, right? So if you reach a certain threshold for women in cabinet, then anything beyond that, right, would automatically mean that women would be stepping into fairly strong cabinet positions. That's just inevitable. Of course, this will depend also on cabinet size, right? How portfolios are distributed within a cabinet. I think 17%, 5 female members to a 27-member cabinet is just about there. But again, I want to issue a note of caution. That's the minimum. That's, I think, the minimum that we should be asking for now. We shouldn't settle as a society, as advocates, we should not settle for anything less than 5 full ministerial positions. And if I could explain that a little further by what I mean by full ministerial positions. Now, one bad habit I think that our political system has developed since I think really the Najib reign was to bloat up the Prime Minister's department with ministerial positions. Now, these ministers hold portfolios at the discretion of the Prime Minister, and they don't have their own ministry. So, for example, the law minister doesn't have her own law ministry, right? So the budget that actually flows to the Prime Minister, the budget line is actually the Prime Minister's budget line, right? So her allocation, how she spends it, etc., she has less control over how those sorts of budgets are spent, right? Compare that to a ministry that's independent and has its own budget line. That's one good example. So when we look at, for example, the former health minister who was moved out of the health ministry and now made the Minister of Federal Territories, she has not been given a full portfolio, although that portfolio has been given its own ministry in the past. She is a minister sitting under the Prime Minister's department, and that dilutes somewhat her ability to manage her portfolio and run it independently.
Mm. So, Maha, as I said earlier, a lot of the focus when it comes to women in politics has been focused on the participation of women in the political field to get them elected as members of parliament so that the pool to select a minister for cabinet becomes bigger. But in Malaysia, we can always appoint women to cabinet through senatorship. And I was wondering whether you could help us think this through. What does that mean to appoint a woman to cabinet through senatorship? How do we align that with democratic principles of accountability? How do we enforce safeguards that will ensure transparency and fairness in such appointments?
So the rule of thumb and the default position should always be in a parliamentary democracy that members of cabinet must come from the elected house, simply because then you can see the direct line of accountability back to the electorate. But in certain situations, it is entirely appropriate, entirely possible to appoint ministers from the Senate as well, which is a non-elected house in Malaysia. But those situations should be restricted, in my opinion, to the appointment or to select portfolios that perhaps require a technocrat, simply because of the issue, the subject matter. Now, in Malaysia, however, there are no such limitations, right? Through different administrations throughout our history, prime ministers have appointed senators as ministers, or rather made ministers and then made them senators, usually for political purposes. Yeah. So it is not a practice I encourage, but seeing as how it is being practiced currently in Malaysia, we should ask ourselves, why aren't prime ministers utilizing this power to increase the number of women in cabinet where there is a shortage of so-called talent within the MPs in the House, the female MPs in the House. Yeah. Now, recently the Prime Minister appointed, I believe, a second finance minister who came from the corporate side. Yeah, a technocrat, a good appointment. But why could a woman not have taken that role? We have illustrious, expert and skilled and experienced women within the business field, commerce field, and who could take up that role similarly, right? So I think if we are going to continue to see senatorships as a means of also filling up cabinet positions, then I think this could be one way in which to introduce more women into cabinet.
So, based on your findings, what policy recommendations would you then propose so that we see more cabinet representation, better portfolio distribution that reflects gender equality in Malaysian politics?
So I think we should, as a whole, start expecting more from our politicians and our prime ministers in terms of cabinet appointments. We should expect a quota of at least, as I say, minimum of 17%, 5 ministers to 27 or 28 member cabinet. And simply because just having or asking for a quota for the number of MPs is not enough. If we have a quota for the number of female ministers in cabinet, it could actually even help with increasing the number of women that are fielded as candidates, simply because if a quota is in place for cabinet, then parties will feel the pressure to make sure not only that they have enough women running, but they have women running in winnable seats. Because now the current problem is even when they field women, a lot of parties put them in unwinnable seats, right? So it will have that knock-on effect. Just to give you an example, recently of 2 countries where prime ministers have taken on this role of just imposing a self-imposed quota. Canada, through Justin Trudeau in 2015, promised 50% female cabinet ministers in his cabinet, and he's held to that. And I think Spain currently is looking at introducing legally binding cabinet quotas as well, requiring each gender to hold at least 40% of cabinet positions.
Okay, so it can be done. It can be done. Maha, thank you so much for sharing your fascinating research with us on the show. Appreciate your time. And that's all we have for you on this episode of The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.